It was already late at night. The neighborhood was completely quiet, with nothing but the sound of crickets echoing through the yard. Suddenly, a woman named Anne woke up after hearing the sound of glass shattering somewhere in the house. Startled, she immediately woke her husband, Richard. Richard was naturally a timid man, but that night he quickly grabbed an old weapon that once belonged to his late father and loaded it with bullets. His hands were shaking badly. At that time, robberies had been happening everywhere, and the fear was very real. Before moving, he slowly glanced at his son, Jordan, who was still sleeping peacefully in his room. Then he noticed a beam of flashlight moving inside the living room. Realizing that someone had broken into the house, Richard became even more nervous. With trembling hands, he raised the weapon, hoping only to scare the intruder away. Both of them were startled by the sudden encounter. But at that exact moment, the old wall clock suddenly rang loudly. The unexpected sound startled Richard so badly that his finger reflexively pulled the trigger. The shot fired instantly. The bullet struck the burglar directly in the eye, passing straight through. The man collapsed and died on the spot. Richard stood there frozen in shock. He had just killed someone, even though he had only meant to scare the intruder. That single gunshot would change everything. This is cold in July. Not long after that, the police arrived and began questioning Richard and Anne about what had happened. A police commander named Price informed them that the man Richard had shot was a criminal named Freddie Russell. Soon after, Richard was taken to the police station for further investigation. At the station, the officers confiscated his weapon. At first, Richard feared he might be sent to prison, but he soon received unexpected news. The case was ruled as self-defense. Richard had no criminal record and was known as a good citizen. Meanwhile, the burglar he shot, Freddie Russell, was apparently a wanted fugitive. Because of that, Commander Price eventually released him. Even so, Richard was still deeply shaken. He could not stop thinking about the fact that he had accidentally killed an unarmed man. The next morning, Richard tried to return to his normal life. He cleaned the blood stains from the wall, took Jordan to school, and later went back to work at his picture frame shop. At lunchtime, he stopped by a small diner, but the atmosphere felt strange. People kept staring at him. The news about the shooting had already spread across the country and gone viral. The attention made him extremely uncomfortable. A while later, Commander Price came to see him and mentioned that the burglar's body would soon be buried. Richard then asked whether Freddie had any family. Price explained that Freddie's father was a prisoner who happened to be released from prison that very day. Hearing that immediately filled Richard with dread. That night, he could barely sleep. The following days passed with him constantly distracted and lost in his thoughts. The next day, Richard visited the cemetery to see the grave where Freddie had been buried by the authorities. But suddenly, someone approached him from behind and startled him. It was Russell, Freddie's father, who had just been released from prison. Richard immediately apologized and explained that the shooting had been an accident. He had never intended to kill anyone. Russell simply smiled in a strange way and made a comment about Richard's son looking very much like him. The remark sent a chill through Richard's body. He felt deeply intimidated. Without wasting any time, he hurried back home to check on Jordan, afraid that his child might now be in danger. From a distance, Russell watched him leave. It felt as if he was planning revenge. Terrified, Richard went to the police station and asked for protection. Unfortunately, Price refused. Russell had not made any direct threats, and Price believed Richard was overreacting. With no other choice, Richard returned home and decided to reinforce the house with stronger locks. But when he arrived, he noticed something disturbing. The lock on the door had already been broken by someone. Realizing the danger, Richard quickly told Anne to take Jordan to the police station and ask for protection. Meanwhile, he cautiously entered the house himself, carrying a tire iron for defense. As he quietly searched through the house, he noticed that Jordan's bedroom window was open. Then he discovered something even more terrifying. Dozens of bullets had been scattered around Jordan's teddy bear. That same night, the police returned to Richard's house. This time, Commander Price finally agreed to provide protection for Richard and his family. However, there was a condition. They were told to behave normally, as if nothing had happened. Officers would secretly watch the house from outside, waiting for the person behind the threats to make a move. If the attacker showed up, the police would arrest him immediately. In other words, Richard and his family were being used as bait. The police still had no proof that Russell was the one terrorizing them. Later that night, distant thunder began to rumble, signaling that rain was on the way. Price positioned his officers around the house, hiding them in strategic spots. Inside the house, a tactical specialist named Kevin stayed on guard. Around midnight, Richard and his family went to bed like usual, while the officers waited patiently outside, expecting Russell to appear. But hours passed, and there was still no sign of him. Richard, however, could not sleep. Feeling restless, he got up and planned to make himself a warm glass of milk. Not long after that, a car slowly drove past the house. Kevin immediately alerted Price and the other officers. Everyone prepared for action, but the car simply continued down the road and disappeared into the distance. About 5 minutes later, officers stationed at the nearby intersection found the same car parked inside a small wooded area, but the vehicle was empty. While they were searching the area, Russell had already slipped into Jordan's bedroom. Back inside the house, Richard heard the sound of water dripping from the roof and got up to check the kitchen. Rainwater was leaking through the ceiling. At the same time, Kevin had already been knocked unconscious by Russell. Richard suddenly sensed something was wrong and shouted for Price outside. Then he rushed to Jordan's room and kicked the door open. Jordan was sitting silently on the bed, pointing toward the wide-open window. Realizing what had happened, the police immediately rushed into the forest to chase Russell. The next day, Price brought surprising news. Russell had been captured in Mexico. Richard was asked to come to the station so the case could officially be closed and he could stop worrying. Relieved to hear that the nightmare was finally over, Richard went to meet Price at the Texas police station. But once he arrived, something immediately caught his attention. There was a wanted poster of Freddie Russell on the wall, and the face on that poster looked completely different from the burglar Richard had shot that night. That meant the man he killed was not Freddie Russell, and if that was true, then he had never killed Russell's son. Confused and disturbed, Richard demanded an explanation. Price insisted that the poster was simply an old photo, but Richard remained certain. The man he shot was not the person in that picture. Price dismissed his concerns, claiming that Richard's trauma was probably affecting his memory. Then he told Richard to go home and forget about the case since it had already been resolved. But Richard could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Price seemed strangely determined to convince him that the burglar was Freddie. It made Richard wonder what the police were hiding. Why would they fake Freddie's death if the person who died that night was actually someone else? Still searching for answers, Richard later returned to the police station. But just as he arrived, he was shocked to see Russell being escorted away by Price and several officers. Curious, Richard hid nearby and quietly followed them through the cold night fog. Soon he discovered where they were going. They brought Russell to a railroad track. Then Price injected him with a sedative. From a distance, Richard watched in disbelief, wondering what they were planning to do. Russell struggled at first, but the sedative quickly weakened him. Soon he could barely move. The officers then laid his body across the railroad tracks, arranging the scene so it would look like a suicide. After Price and his team left, Richard remained hidden, frozen with uncertainty. If he tried to help, he could be killed. But if he walked away, the man would certainly die. Then in the distance, the sound of an approaching train began to echo. With time running out, Richard made his decision. He rushed forward, pulled Russell off the tracks, and saved his life. After that, he brought him to an old cabin that once belonged to Richard's father and chained Russell's leg so he could not escape. The next morning, while Anne was shopping with him, she noticed that Richard's shoes were dirty. He casually brushed it off and said he had slipped in a ditch the night before. Later that day, Richard returned to the cabin and brought Russell some fries. By this point, Richard was convinced of one thing. He had not killed Freddie Russell. The police had lied to both of them and manipulated everything for reasons that were still unclear. Meanwhile, Russell admitted that he had not seen his son Freddie for a very long time. To prove the truth, Richard proposed something drastic. They would dig up the grave. Late that night, the two men quietly dug up the grave and pulled the coffin out of the ground. When they opened it, the truth became immediately clear. The body inside was not Freddie. Freddie was known to have blonde hair, but the corpse in the coffin did not match that description. Even more disturbing, the body's teeth had been removed and its fingers had been cut off. Someone had clearly gone to great lengths to make sure the victim could never be identified. Now that Russell knew his son was still alive, the tension between him and Richard slowly faded. The two men formed an uneasy alliance. Richard agreed to help Russell track down Freddie, while Russell contacted an old friend who might be able to assist them. As he made the call, Russell noticed a small child sitting nearby, and the sight only deepened the longing he felt for the son he had not seen in years. The following day, Commander Price unexpectedly showed up at Richard's frame shop. He claimed that Freddie had dyed his hair and worn contact lenses on the night of the break-in, which supposedly explained why Richard might have mistaken his appearance. But Richard already knew the truth, so he simply pretended to accept the explanation and acted as if nothing seemed suspicious. Not long after Price left, the man Russell had contacted arrived at the shop. His name was Jim. He casually asked Richard to make a frame for a photo of a girl he admired, which gave them the perfect excuse to meet. Once they left together, Jim drove Richard to meet Russell in a red car decorated with large bull horns on the front. It soon became clear that Jim was not just an old friend. He was a private detective. Jim had already been investigating Freddie and brought along a collection of information about him. According to Jim, Freddie had once been part of a violent criminal group known as the Dixie Mafia. The organization was infamous for its ruthless members who would do almost anything for money. Despite everything, Russell still wanted to find his son. Jim suggested that they move somewhere safer and stay out of Commander Price's jurisdiction while they searched. As a detective, Jim had connections inside several government agencies. Through one of his contacts at the FBI, he had learned the full story about Freddie. Freddie had originally been arrested as a member of the Dixie Mafia. In order to capture the higher-ranking leaders of the organization, the FBI offered him a deal. If he revealed the locations of his fellow members, he would receive protection. Freddie agreed to betray the group. In return, the FBI placed him in a witness protection arrangement, faked his death, and gave him a new identity. This was meant to keep the Mafia from hunting him down for his betrayal. With this information, the three men decided to continue their search for Freddie. Richard also joined the mission, partly because he still wanted to know the identity of the burglar he had killed that night. Before leaving town, he told his wife Anne that he had to travel for a business matter. Anne supported him without hesitation. Soon after, they arrived in Houston at Jim's property, where he ran a small pig farm as a side business. Using records from the Department of Motor Vehicles, Jim had narrowed down their search. There had been 162 newly issued driver's licenses for men around Freddie's age. Out of those, 47 were Caucasian. 28 of them were about 6 feet tall. Only 2 had blue eyes. One still lived with his parents. The other was a man named Frank Miller, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a height close to 6 feet. Richard could hardly believe that someone who spent his days raising pigs could also perform such detailed investigative work. Following the lead, they drove to Frank Miller's address. But the moment they arrived, a large man suddenly slammed into their car, furious about the dent it had caused to the vehicle's bullhorn decoration. Jim demanded compensation, but the situation quickly turned violent when the man attacked him. Russell stepped forward, ready to fight back, but Jim suddenly recovered and knocked the man unconscious with a well-placed kick. While searching the area, they found a weapon and accidentally kicked open the trunk of the man's car. Inside were dozens of unmarked videotapes. Jim grabbed one of the tapes before they quickly left the scene. Frank Miller himself was nowhere to be found. Back at their hideout, Jim played the tape. What they saw was horrifying. The recording showed explicit footage involving an underage girl. 2 men appeared in the video, and one of them was clearly Freddie, now living under the name Frank Miller. Even worse, the girl was brutally tortured and beaten with a baseball bat until she died. It became clear that after escaping the Dixie Mafia, Freddie had not changed his ways at all. Instead, he had become even more monstrous, producing illegal videos that would be sold on the black market for enormous profit. Richard could barely watch the footage as the girl was beaten to death. Upstairs, Russell had just finished taking a shower and had not yet seen what was on the tape. Jim knew that if Russell watched the video, it would completely destroy him. So he planned to tell Russell that they had gone to the wrong house and that Frank Miller had nothing to do with Freddie. But before he could finish the lie, Russell walked downstairs and insisted on seeing the tape himself. Jim tried to make excuses, but Russell refused to back down. Eventually, Jim handed him the tape and told him to watch it alone. Then Jim quietly led Richard outside, leaving Russell behind to see the truth for himself. Not long after watching the tape, Russell sat silently inside his car, holding a weapon in his hand. The truth about his son had shattered him. The boy he once loved had turned into something monstrous. Meanwhile, back at the house, Richard urged Jim to report the video to the police, but Jim quickly shut down the idea. According to him, the police would not do anything about it. In fact, they probably already knew exactly what Freddie was doing. Some of them might even be receiving a cut from the illegal tape sales. After all, the victims in those videos were undocumented girls from Mexico. People like that often disappeared without anyone asking questions. Jim also explained more about Russell's past. Russell had once been a highly respected soldier, but his life fell apart after he refused an order from his commanding officer and ended up assaulting him. That decision sent him to prison and separated him from Freddie, the only child he had ever truly loved. Now Russell was faced with the horrifying reality of what his son had become. With tears in his eyes and his emotions in chaos, Russell made a decision. If anyone was going to stop Freddie, it would be him. Soon after, they spotted Freddie leaving the building with the same large man they had encountered earlier. The group quietly followed them from a distance. It turned out Freddie was running a small shop that sold music and movie tapes. The store was just a front for his real operation. After a while, the Mexican man left the shop to get food. That gave them a chance. Richard was sent inside to see how many people were still there. Trying to stay calm, Richard pretended to browse through the tapes like a normal customer. But the moment Freddy started paying attention to him, the tension rose instantly. Just then, the Mexican man returned earlier than expected. Outside, Jim quickly honked the car horn to warn Richard. The man had recognized him from before. Fortunately, Richard managed to slip out of the store without causing suspicion. He reported back that the shop closed at 11 that night. Back at their hideout, the three men began preparing their weapons. They were getting ready for a full assault against Freddy and everyone working with him. Richard, who was easily startled, was given a shorter weapon so he would not accidentally fire recklessly during the operation. That night, after the shop closed, Freddy left and returned to his home. The three men followed quietly, their faces darkened with charcoal to blend into the night. But suddenly, another car arrived behind Freddy's vehicle. It was carrying several of his associates. When the trunk opened, they saw a drunk young woman. She was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico who had been tricked with the promise of a job interview. Instead, she was being taken somewhere isolated. The vehicles drove deep into the forest and eventually stopped near an old building hidden in the darkness. Moving carefully, the three men approached the area. One person was still standing outside the building. When they got closer, they realized it was the producer responsible for filming the tapes. Jim silently eliminated him before he could make a sound. From there, the group split up. Richard quietly moved through the building, but suddenly ran into another man. Both of them were startled. The man was bigger and quickly grabbed Richard's gun, nearly firing it so close that Richard almost lost part of his ear. Acting fast, Richard struck him in the liver. The man collapsed and died moments later. Richard then moved through the kitchen area, but suddenly someone opened fire at him. Just in time, Russell appeared and killed the attacker without hesitation. Together, they rushed upstairs. Another armed man was already waiting at the staircase. Richard and Russell were trapped for a moment, but Jim stepped in and neutralized the threat. Moments later, they heard a terrified scream coming from one of the rooms. Inside, they discovered a camera set up beside the bed. Russell immediately smashed the equipment and rushed to untie the terrified girl who had been restrained there. Richard tried to calm her down as she trembled with fear. But suddenly, another attacker jumped Jim from behind. Fortunately, the man was quickly killed. When they searched the room further, they found hundreds of videotapes stacked everywhere. The sheer number of recordings made one thing clear. Freddy and his crew had been doing this for a very long time, and the number of victims was far greater than anyone could have imagined. Elsewhere in the building, Russell was searching for Freddy. He eventually spotted him on a balcony, calmly loading bullets into his weapon. For a moment, Russell hesitated. He had not seen his son in years, and deep down, he still wanted to talk to him. Jim and Richard watched from a distance, confused by Russell's silence. They could not understand why he was just standing there, unable to act. That hesitation cost them dearly. Freddy suddenly opened fire, hitting all three of them before they could react. As Freddy moved closer, preparing to finish Richard off, a gunshot suddenly tore through the air. Russell finally pulled the trigger. The bullet ripped into Freddy's stomach, stopping him in his tracks. In that moment, Russell revealed the truth he had been carrying in his heart. He had come not as an enemy, but as a father forced to end the nightmare his own son had created. Freddy looked at him in disbelief, trying to understand whether the man standing in front of him was truly his father. Russell confirmed it without hesitation. Then, with tears in his eyes, he fired again and ended his own son's life. For Russell, Freddy's sins were also his own burden to carry. Not long after, Russell collapsed as well. The gunshot wound in his chest was too severe. Within moments, he took his final breath. With the building now silent, Jim and Richard poured gasoline throughout the place and set it on fire, destroying the evidence of all the horrors that had happened there. They then took the rescued girl and left the scene behind. The following day, Richard and Jim sat quietly outside the pig farm. The wind moved through the trees, carrying fallen leaves across the ground, as if the world itself understood the tragic choice Russell had made. A father who had sacrificed everything to stop the monster his son had become. Eventually, Richard returned home to Anne and Jordan, who were still peacefully asleep. Yet even after everything that had happened, one mystery continued to haunt him. He still had no idea who the burglar was that he had shot on that first night. And with that unanswered question, the story finally comes to an end. So the moral of the story is, if you hear glass breaking at night, maybe call the police first, because one trigger pull might turn your life into a full crime investigation.